All right, George Bagby, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
It's great to be back. I'm very happy to be on tonight.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you on as well. I know obviously we've been talking behind the scenes, but it's good to have another, public conversation because the last ones, I mean, they got a really positive reaction, and I think everyone's happy to see you back on.
Yeah, I had to take a hiatus. The eye of Sauron was on me, but the danger now has passed in a very decisive way. So um, I'm back on, and I'm likely to be doing a lot more now. I've been freed up, as it were.
Well, good. I'm obviously I'm excited for that. I've selfishly at the very least, I'm glad you have a little bit more free time. And
I've got a
so
I've got a really fun project that I really hope to be working on. Um, I don't think he'd mind me saying so, but I've been in talks with Academic Agent about producing an American history course for the academic agency, and I have free time to do that now, surprisingly, unexpectedly, and I'm going to be working on that. I think after I get some things done around the house here, I might start working on that next week. So I'll keep you posted about that. And when it's finished, I mean to do some advertising. I want people to know about it because that's my thing. My thing is American history.
well, and obviously, most of the people who've heard us speak before know that you were my history teacher, and so that kind of neatly segues into our topic for the evening, which is kind of a condensed version of a lecture that you gave me in school, and it's one that was particularly impactful. It's one that I remember to this day. But do you want to just kind of, I guess, introduce our topic for the evening, and then I can bring up the slides after that?
Absolutely. So I made an editorial choice this year because I was teaching American History 2 this year to a high school class. And I decided to start with this lecture, to start with this lesson. I was supposed to start with the Civil War, and I decided to start to frame the Civil War with this particular set of lessons. I usually condense this one down to one lecture. I try to make it like fit in an hour and a half block period, which is probably what you got when you went through my class. But it definitely merits more time than that, and it's one of my favorite subjects. It's about the Second Great Awakening in the north of the United States in the decades just before the Civil War. So if we judge it generously, we can say it lasts from 1800 to 1860 roughly. And it's the Second Great Awakening. We have two periods that we call Great Awakenings in American history. The first period is right before the War for Independence. We have people like George Whitefield and the Wesley brothers who are doing a lot of things in English-speaking Protestant circles. We see the foundation of what becomes the Methodist Church. And this is an interesting movement. The First Great Awakening is a movement towards a low church sort of experience, a more congregational led church government. In a lot of American circles, it meant a revival among the Baptists and a great growth among Baptists who are dissenters, like all-purpose dissenters, and a movement away from organized legacy Protestant denominations. Well, in the Second Great Awakening, we kind of see a repeat of that, but it goes in very strange directions. So these things, the First and Second Great Awakening, they do have some things in common, but the Second Great Awakening is much more weird, much more alien. Yet it gives us a lot of institutions and beliefs and even consumer products that surprise us, that they've become very American elements in the Western world. Even they even have currency well outside of America now. So the lesson is the Second Great Awakening.
So that's a pretty good intro to it. So if you could I guess kind of actually, you know what? Let's just go straight to the slides. We can go through with your presentation instead of me asking questions. So just give me a second to bring that up. And all right. So here's the first slide. Can you all see this?
Yes, I can see it.
Oh, perfect. All right. Should I go to the first slide?
Sure. So as I frequently do in my lectures in history, I do a lot of comparisons and contrasts, and especially leading right up to the Civil War, it makes sense to do a lot of these contrasts with the North and the South. And this is something about the Second Great Awakening that makes it very unique in American history, is that it's part of the sectional conflict, especially that it's happening right before the greatest war in American history, the biggest sacrifice and struggle in American history, the contest between the North and the South. So here I'm kind of reviewing things that I've been making a point of in my class up until this point. The North has practically all of the cities, with the exception of New Orleans. Louisiana is always so exceptional. New Orleans is really the only city of any size in the South. The rest of the South is very rural. The North has an industrial base. The North is the center of the merchant marine. Practically all ocean-going ships are owned and operated out of the North. They dock in the South. The South has a lot of commerce, but those aren't Southerners on those ships. Those aren't Southerners manning those ships. And by the way, they aren't Southerners bringing the slaves over back when the slave trade was legal. Those were Northerners and foreigners mostly doing that. The Southern trend is agricultural. The vast majority of Southerners are directly engaged in agriculture on some level. So the Northern trend is what I could characterize as modern. We're going to talk more about what modern is, what modernism is. What are these people talking about when they say they have modern ideas? It is strongly related to the rejection of traditional beliefs, traditional ways of living, in favor of newfangled ways. The South is in contrast traditional. Now, we could go on about this contrast. I bookend this lecture with another lecture in the series about what Richard M. Weaver called the older religiousness of the South. And this is something that the Vanderbilt agrarians also commemorated in their book, I'll Take My Stand, about how the South is this even a medieval sort of holdout of Christendom. The South does not experience these religious innovations in this period. The South remains tied to its older religious beliefs, which is mostly low church Protestantism, mostly Baptists and Methodists, actually. But they don't undergo this period of religious innovation and hysteria and fanaticism that the North experiences during this time. So the Northern trend is also centralized economically. You have these big trade and manufacturing centers in the North, major port cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York City, Cincinnati, Chicago, places like that. Whereas the Southern trend is very decentralized. There are lots of local centers of influence and authority, and they are populated mostly by people engaged in agriculture. So the Southern trend has always been with, or had always been up until this point, it had always been with centers of influence and authority in regions and in states. So the Northern trend, you have this popularity of Northerners thinking of the Union as the final governmental authority in all matters in which people should be united. And they increasingly think that Americans should be on the same page about more and more things. Their culture in the North, the political culture in the North, mirrors their economic experience in that it becomes more centralized and less diverse in a certain sense. In the South, the word that we use to describe this decentralization and many local centers of influence and authority, the old American term for that is a federal vision of politics. American federalism is also termed a vision of states' rights, where states have the final authority on what the Constitution means, what is constitutional law. You have a lot of southern states talking about nullifying federal laws, believing that they have a constitutional mandate to do that, and many Southerners also saying from even the ratification of the Constitution forward that states have the right to leave the Union because the center of authority lies in regions and localities, not in a central federal government created by those states, by those regions. So that's a federal vision, and that's rather what Thomas Jefferson meant when he was talking about republicanism and such. Jefferson has a lot to do with those ideas. Anyway, in the North during these decades before the Civil War, we see this growth of new religious groups, and in the South, you see a faithfulness to their old religious formulas, and you also kind of amusingly, you see a lot of alarm and shock and dismay in the South about what's going on in the North during these years. Southerners are writing observations of these Northern religious groups, kind of commenting, these people are going insane. Can we really be in a union with people like this who believe such radical, strange things?
How much of this had to do with the different groups that I guess emigrated or settled the different parts of the old America of the original 13 colonies? Sorry, I jumbled that, but how much of that had to do with like the different, I guess, like groups that made it up, and specifically like the religious groups and where they settled, I guess was the best way to say that.
I think that these things are strongly connected. And many people in our circles are aware of the great history book Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher. One of the things that I did, and I'm sure you remember this, I edited chapters from Albion's Seed and I distributed it to my history students. And I've been doing that ever since I've started teaching American history. I called them the Folkways presentations. And it wasn't just chapters from Albion's Seed. I've been working really hard to build chapters or build handouts for my other students about other groups in the United States, immigrant groups, for instance, and their characteristics. But the predominant characteristics in American history come from the old Anglo-American stock. We have other very important groups in American history. I am not denying their influence. I'm not denying their importance. I'm not denying their prevalence or anything. I really like them and appreciate them. The Irish Americans, the Germans, there are other major influences, but the Anglo-American groups found themselves in conflict here, just as they had been in conflict back in England. Even though they're all Anglos, they are differentiated by region of England, by religious tradition, and by many other things that Fisher documents in his book. They have different. They've got different food. They live in different housing. Their religious differences are major. He has 4 different groups that he talks about: Quakers, Puritans, the Virginia Cavaliers, and the famous Scotch Irish, who go mostly to the backcountry, to the Appalachians. So of those 4, the Scotch Irish and the Cavaliers form what we come to see as Southern civilization. The Northerners and Southerners obviously find themselves in conflict with one another about a great many things, not just political, economic beliefs about slavery, but also beliefs about the past. What do we do with our heritage? Is there a constructive use for it? Must it be rejected in some radical way? Must we have some kind of purgation of religious heritage or cultural heritage? One of the things that makes the North stand out from colonial days is the agreement among Quakers and Puritans that their religious heritage in England cannot be salvaged. It basically needs to be redone from top to bottom. It needs to be demolished and completely renovated, completely rebuilt. The term Puritan, for instance, it refers to their religious belief that the Church of England was deeply tainted by Roman Catholic beliefs and practices and must be purified. And that's a very radical position. The Puritans rejected the church calendar. They would punish people that celebrated Christmas. These are people that took this separatism and this purgative view of their religious past and their culture as English people. They wanted to get rid of old traditions. They wanted to get rid of old beliefs because they believed those things were evil. They believed that Roman Catholicism was of the devil, which is one of the reasons why they punished people that observed these things, even people who claimed to be Protestants in all other respects. So these traits do have a lot to do with the things we see in the Second Great Awakening, and the difference we see between Northern and Southern religious traditions.
Well, it's like that old line, right? That the war between the states should be understood as a sequel to the British Civil War. Because essentially you
Indeed.
have those men's descendants fighting it out again, just across the ocean.
Absolutely, and that is a classic old interpretation of the American Civil War. You have a lot of Americans and also foreign observers saying this is the Anglo version of the repetition of history. You look at the history of France, and it seems that the French reenact dramatic episodes from their history over and over again. The French Revolution, and then the Revolution in 1848. Or the Paris Commune in the Franco-Prussian War. These things do seem to have a lot in common. But we can look at the history of Anglo-Americans in England and in the United States, and we see some commonalities there too. Cavaliers and Roundheads, we can see them in both places.
All right, should I go to the next slide now?
Yes, please. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening is initially characterized by a popularity of revival meetings. Evangelists would travel around, mostly in the North. Now, this did happen in the South as well. The camp meetings did what they did in the First Great Awakening. They seemed to swell the ranks of established low church Protestants in the South, Baptists and Methodists for the most part. If we wanted to make a comparison these days, we would say it would be like Pentecostal worship or something, the growth of Pentecostal sects. These are emotional responses that people are getting in the camp meeting atmosphere. In the North, the camp meetings seem to produce rather different results, much more innovative results. So what happens is there are traveling evangelists. They go from place to place. They may stay in one place for a week or so, give sermons every night, get a response from the audience. One of the innovations that come out of the Second Great Awakening camp meetings is the altar call, which many American Christians now associate strongly with normalcy or tradition. In the tradition I come from, the pastors that I grew up knowing, all Southern Baptists, that's the tradition of my birth. Those pastors would talk among themselves with pride that they had never given a sermon without an altar call. And they portrayed themselves as very traditional, old-fashioned sorts of Baptists. They took that as a point of authority. Yet the altar call is something that becomes popular with the Second Great Awakening. We can actually trace its origin and such. And it was controversial at the time. The altar call is where there is emotional music played at the end of a service. The preacher makes an impassioned declaration for the members of the congregation to dedicate their lives to Jesus Christ. They sing an emotional chorus, and they may sing the chorus for many stanzas. This could go on for a while, especially if the response has traction. There are a lot of people responding, people coming down to the altar at the foot of the pulpit, which is a really interesting connection there. The pulpit and the altar kind of unified in this kind of religious expression. I am Eastern Orthodox now, and the idea of the pulpit and the altar being in any sort of even proximity to one another is really shocking to me now. Like that is a really different kind of expression and different sort of symbolism. I think Roman Catholics and many liturgical Protestants would recognize that as a difference as well. I know in many Presbyterian churches, the pulpit is off to the side. It's not in the center.
Yes, in my experience, that's the case, right? I mean, where I go to church, so that's very much true in my experience, at least.
Indeed, think of old-fashioned American Protestant church, say in Charleston or Philadelphia or some old place, a very ornate wooden box, with a little twirling staircase going up to it or something, over on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of a church. That's the sort of thing, and that would fit with my tradition more or less. The homily is given from the side, and also the homily is not the main point of the service. The Eucharist is. The homily could be omitted. It's not even a necessary part. But with the camp meeting, it's all about the homily. It's about the speaker. It's about the evangelist who is talking and explaining scripture or some point of theology, or eventually it came to be social causes that the evangelist was focusing on in the meetings and asking people to dedicate themselves to a cause, maybe in the name of Jesus, but it seems to be auxiliary to traditional Christianity or separate from traditional Christianity. You can advance the slide now.
Sure, just give me a second.
So in the North, well, and in the South as well, to the extent the Second Great Awakening is influential there. It's a movement away from organized religion. There are lots of people creating new religious groups. not all of these groups are in fact religious in focus. So some of them are more humanist, deistical, focused on social causes, maybe exclusively. We're going to look at a couple of those. These are outliers. They're not very popular, but they're nevertheless influential. They tended to have a lot of literary people involved, so they were popular for that. But it's a movement away from the legacy denominations, if you will. It is Episcopalians becoming Methodists. It is Methodists becoming Baptists. It is Baptists becoming more narrow sectarians. And I'm not talking about what we know of today in America. We talk a lot about the non-denominational Christians. That's not what I'm talking about in this instance. In this case, the people that fall away from organized religion altogether are coming up with their own broad organizations. We're going to see some of them had great ambitions on that front that never bore fruit, and some of them created, some might say denominations, some might say new religions from scratch during this time. Now, I think that this is fascinating, and I take this very seriously. Another thing that I do is I teach Greek literature, ancient Greek literature. I teach Homer and Sophocles and Ovid and Herodotus and things like that. And one thing that I'm always trying to do with my students there is I really want them to take paganism seriously. One of my pet peeves is I strongly dislike the modern approach to the oracle at Delphi, where scoffing, mocking moderns who typically don't know anything about any religious tradition, maybe nothing about their own or anybody else's necessarily. They kind of take a new atheist approach and say, oh, it's all superstition, it's all nonsense. Sophisticated people would never believe these things. And they talk about the oracle at Delphi getting high off of gases and then babbling away in some hallucination, and the priests making money on this on the side. There are a great many reasons to dismiss that interpretation and take the oracle seriously. Just because these people are pagans doesn't mean that there aren't spirits involved. I'm a Christian and I believe in the spiritual world. It's one of the first things we say in the Nicene Creed, right? I believe in that God created all of it, visible and invisible. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if the pagans were actually communing with spirits and getting information from spirits. But I bring that kind of sensibility, that sort of outlook into the Second Great Awakening. I am not entirely sure that the founders of Mormonism were charlatans. For instance, I am willing to accept the possibility. I believe it is certainly possible for people to talk to spirits. I believe that as an article of faith. I've personally had experience with such things myself, but that's beside the point. Joseph Smith may have actually received messages from spirits, and I think they were liars. That's one of the reasons why we're not supposed to mess with spirits, is because we have no idea how to distinguish between an angel and a devil. But this is a very mysterious time in American history where there are new religions coming into being. And these religions are still with us today. And some of them have lots of Christian trappings. I think that it's a productive question to ask. Would you consider this group Christian? Do they believe enough Christian things? Some of them are more likely candidates than others. Maybe we can still call them Christian in some sense, but Others, I think, have obviously gone too far away.
Well, right. And there's a dialogue around this, that people will say like, oh, you Christians will engage in this no true Scotsman fallacy, right? Like, oh, they weren't really Christians. And look, don't get me wrong. There's a whole lot of that, especially now you see it in the more like, you know, excuse me, kind of like out there, like charismatic style, evangelicals, right? Like if you're not, from the Bob Jones Memorial Baptist Church, well, then you're hellbound. But nonetheless, and I kind of know where this is going. There's enough people, there's enough different groups in here that are really quite odd, that are like technically Christian, like they would say so. But
Yes.
there comes a certain point where it's like, well, okay, like, do you really still apply? And I guess we'll get into that more specifically talking about some of these different groups. But I very much see your point because it is an interesting question.
It's a curious one, and it can get kind of frustrating with some Protestant sects, because you can talk to them about the essentials of belief, and more often than not, I found that I can work in organizations with lots of low church Protestants. They tend to be hesitant about things like the creed, but when you sit down with them and talk it out, it's just that they don't want to have an old creed with some unfamiliar words in it, but it turns out they believe everything in the creed.
Right. And we might be getting slightly off topic because we did cover this in another conversation you and I had on, on evangelicals and anti-intellectualism. And I'm not trying to cut us off, because that is an
Oh,
interesting
indeed.
conversation, but we've got a lot of
Yeah.
slides and I do want
Yes.
to get this done in one shot, so to speak.
Yes. Let's proceed. Okay, so one of the things I did with my slideshow here, I cut out most of the text, but I did want to share some quotes and some bullet points with our audience here. And I'm not going to belabor this. It's not like you're taking notes on this, but I did make a mistake in a previous stream with you. I think I mistook Charles Finney for Charles Spurgeon, but
Right, which is a
I ended up,
significant difference, but
yes, obviously. Spurgeon was an Englishman. Um, but I did apologize to those that pointed that out. I made a stream. Well, I made a video, a solo video of my own concerning that, just because I wanted to rectify that. That was an embarrassing error on my part. But I did want to focus in on Charles Finney, because Charles Finney is a very instrumental character in the Second Great Awakening. He we could quote him saying a number of interesting, influential, important things that characterize some of these evangelists that doing the tent meetings during this time. He is very famous for tent meetings. If we look at his quotes that I selected here, Finney said, "The gospel has been made of no effect by the traditions of man." Now, I think that this is a exceptional quote and a very revealing sort of statement about the Second Great Awakening and something of the spirit of it. This is an anti-traditional sort of movement. This is going away from the organized denominations, the Protestant denominations. I don't believe this is going on in the American Catholic world at all, which is far smaller back then. It's practically only Irish immigrants back then. There are a couple of exceptions. Orestes Bronson is an Anglo convert to Catholicism way back then. He's a very interesting character. But Charles Finney, when he talks about the traditions of man, he lambasts Roman Catholicism, but he's not speaking to Roman Catholics in this sermon. He's talking to a Protestant audience, overwhelmingly Protestant, and he is dumping on the Protestant churches. So what happens in these tent meetings, these camp meetings, these revivals, is people like Finney go around and say, you need to have an intense experience, an individualized experience of religion. And you should be suspicious of what the established clergy and the Sunday schools and churches around here have taught you what religion is and what it means to be a confessing, disciplined Christian in this community. And this leaves his converts with an interesting perspective. The evangelist always moves on. The evangelist leaves his disciples behind, as it were, and they frequently form new congregations. But these things don't always work out. There are an awful lot of disillusioned people after this who fall out of church membership, fall out of church attendance entirely. And we're going to revisit this phenomenon later, because there's an important character that we visit that talks about this directly. Another thing Finney says, God has found it necessary to take advantage of the excitability there is in mankind, to produce powerful excitements among them before he can lead them to obey. Now, this corresponds to what I had said about Finney previously when I mistakenly called him Spurgeon, when Finney justified creating emotional outbursts in his congregants in order to get them to make an emotional commitment at the altar call. And he discounts, a reasoned decision in favor of the emotional moment.
There's a certain sense in which he's kind of like a Protestant Edward Bernays, a little bit less of, like, obviously much less cynical, but in kind of the
Right.
same way that it was like an escalation in arms almost, that unless you could match it, you were kind of out-competed to a certain degree.
Indeed. Now, I want to be quite clear. I'm very hesitant to call any of these people cynical. I don't like looking in history and discounting what is said and what is done as pure cynicism. I think that may happen far more often these days, but I'm not teaching the history of the 2020s. I'm teaching history of a long time back.
Well, and
I think this guy was completely sincere.
I said he was less cynical than Bernays.
Absolutely. I think Bernays was cynical.
Hard to clear, but
absolutely. Yeah, but I think Finney was doing emotional manipulation, and I think that he was manipulating people sincerely, believing he was doing good and saving their souls.
Well, and right, like when you've accepted the premise that if you firmly believe that people who don't listen to you are going to be condemned to an eternity of torment, like, given that premise, emotionally manipulating people is the lesser of two evils,
Right. Now, I've already listed these things out, but I did want to go over them a little bit. Finney was a progressive of his day. He did things like he had women lead prayer in his meetings. This caused a big controversy in his day. This is obviously against the Christian tradition in worship and leadership in church. He gave these very emotional altar calls. This becomes mainstreamed in certain circles. He popularizes praise choruses. I read about Dwight L. Moody, a Chicago evangelist who was a contemporary and disciple of Finney. And Moody does a lot to mainstream that practice as well. Now, what's interesting about that is those old praise choruses from Finney's day are like the classic old hymns in some churches. like Fanny Crosby eventually contributes to that tradition. She's not connected with Finney, but um, Amazing Grace is an example of that tradition. And you'll notice that many of the hymns in that style, done in that style, are individualized in focus. They're talking about the grace that saved a wretch like me. It's about me. Now that's interesting because the church music that Finney is reacting against is more holistic. Um, the older hymns of the established congregations of his day are singing about an event in the life of Christ, or they're singing about what baptism does, or something like that. It's a more universal thing. It's not an individual focus thing. And I've always thought that is a very important thing. Um, Nevertheless, when we look back at the Second Great Awakening, it's far enough away that it's outside of the thinking of a lot of people who think of themselves as traditional believers. That's too far in the past for them to realize that this is the origin of some of these practices. Another important aspect, which it has a huge influence in the Second Great Awakening, is the social reforms that Finney brings into the pulpit and proclaims with his evangel. While he is teaching the gospel, he is also teaching for radical abolitionism, the immediate emancipation of the slaves in the United States. And other causes that we will see. Some have explained these things as a form of Christian socialism, so-called Christian socialism. Finney goes off to Ohio. He's from New York. He spends most of his career in upstate New York, but he does go west into Ohio to found Oberlin College. If you advance the slide, we'll see.
All right, just give me a second. Again, it's a little clunky, but.
So Oberlin College starts out as a revivalist minister's school of higher education for social reform and humanism. So this is you could say it's evangelical in the sense that it's founded by evangelists. But in the context of antebellum America, this is a very progressive institution from its start. Oberlin College is one of the first schools in the United States to have co-ed students, to admit both male and female students. And it is one of the very first to have a racially integrated student body. So well before the Civil War, they're taking Black students at Oberlin College. And this is something that, not surprisingly, Oberlin is extremely proud of these days. But true to their origin, Oberlin is known as one of the liberal arts schools that are on the extreme left of things. Oberlin College was founded in part to spread abolitionist ideas. And Charles Finney is part of this. He says that these ideas are essential for the work of the gospel to take place on earth. So if we don't have these social reforms popularized, then people are not living the Christian life. Now, I'm on your show, so I can say things here that I wouldn't necessarily say elsewhere, like in my class, for instance. This is not something that my students could handle very well, but the notion that radical abolitionism is absolutely necessary for one to be a Christian is a pernicious and new notion. The Bible is full of holy men who owned slaves. And this includes the New Testament. We have the book of Philemon, for instance, where the apostle sends a runaway slave back to his owner and writes an epistle about the action. The book of Philemon does not instruct the man that owns Onesimus, the slave, to set the man free, even though both of them are Christians. It's merely explaining the circumstances, and the apostle Paul is sending the slave back to his master. This sort of thing strikes modern Americans in a very strange way. But perhaps they're even more alarmed by the injunctions we see in several books in the New Testament. In 2 Peter, the apostle says, "Slaves, obey your masters, even the mean ones, even the froward ones, even the ones that aren't treating you well." And this is an injunction that comes right alongside children, obey your parents, and wives, obey your husbands. All three of which are hierarchical relationships. The Bible does not destroy those hierarchical relationships. The Bible teaches doctrines to reinforce those relationships. So this idea that Christians must be radical abolitionists, it's important, at least in the historical context here. This is not something that Christians have ever taught before. And I think I can just leave it at that. It's a novel new doctrine.
Right. That's interesting because you and I had a conversation, off air, just on the phone. And I'm not trying to turn this into a massive, tangent, but it's about, I guess, the kind of a new saint in Christian circles of MLK, right? That
Right.
The idea that he is kind of this preeminent example of what it is to be a Christian. There's this kind of like syncretic gospel of, anti-racist Christianity.
Right.
And you can have your own opinions on slavery. You may or may not like it. But at the very least, like the widest, I guess, reading you can take is that the Bible is neutral on slavery.
Right.
And it's especially aggravating, from a Protestant perspective, where there's this doctrine of sola scriptura, right? Like only scripture, just like going back to that and going back to that. But except on this one thing, And so again, I'm not trying to turn this into a tangent, but that's an interesting point and not something I'd considered so explicitly.
Indeed. Well, obviously the institution of slavery has just caused endless problems for Americans just generally. And many of our modern conflicts and agonizing attitudes stem back to our inability to deal with that problem and digest it and set it to rest. And that's very unfortunate for us.
Well, it really is kind of like the crack that runs through our society. I mean, maybe at one point in time there could have been a peaceful resolution to that. But at this point, it just seems like there's too many people invested and eager in keeping that divide open and raw and kind of poking at that wound.
There is obviously a lot of political hay to be made of it. There's a lot of money to be made of it. But we will go on. I think that it is very notable that I think it's the United States and Haiti are the only two countries that abolished the institution of slavery by violence and with no political plan for what happened afterwards. Of course, these countries are very different from each other. In Haiti, there was kind of a wholesale slaughter that followed that did not follow in the United States. Our slaughter was just armies of regions fighting and killing one another by the hundreds of thousands. But we will move on to more details about the Second Great Awakening. I haven't gotten to the fun part yet, and we will skip along till we get to that. In the Second Great Awakening, we see many examples of what early Christians called chiliasm. We could use an English word for it and call it millennialism. Millennialism is utopian religious belief that expects some kind of earthly expression of an ideal world. Now, this is in contrast to the kind of traditional religious expression that people like Charles Finney, not to dump too hard on Charles Finney, I want to give the man his due, but people like Charles Finney were contrasting their evangel with. Charles Finney did not like the modest position of traditional faith. Traditional religious belief it's a belief that salvation is a kind of mystery, and that is something that is accomplished ultimately by God, not by man. It is divine grace that works out the salvation of humanity. Human beings need to cooperate with this in some form or another, but this is a profound mystery that we also see in the gospel. Christ says his kingdom is not of this world. Millennialism denies that statement of Christ and expects to see the kingdom of God established on earth by man. Now, they might say, well, it's God working through them, but they expect to see evil purged from the world, or evil purged from their special community. Now, this is an American tradition. Both the Quakers and Puritans in the North, as David Hackett Fisher points out, did expect to set up kinds of utopian communities. You may recall from early American history, communes and communal experiments, abolishing property and such, were done in the South as well. Now, these things always failed very quickly, but the colony of Georgia was set up as a utopian commune. Jamestown was originally a communist experiment with a master plan, but these things fizzled out very quickly because the incentives weren't right. The people were not able to survive. So if we advance on to the next slide, we'll see some millennialism at work. Oh, here we go.
Is this what you wanted, or should I go to the next?
Yes, I actually didn't expect the rest of those notes there. Just my fault. I've already said New England began with this theological notion that the right belief could build the perfect society. So maybe the least interesting movement to come out of this, at least I find it to be the least interesting, are the Unitarians, who in more recent times merged with the Universalists and became known as UU, the Unitarian Universalists. Now, these are interesting, I suppose, in that they made the talking points of the Democratic Party their statement of faith. And if you want to know what Unitarians believe, you don't have to look very far. They like to post it on the fronts of their churches. They do not believe in any Christian creeds. Unlike their Puritan forefathers, they don't believe that Christ was God. They don't believe he was born of a virgin. They don't believe that he died or rose again or ascended into heaven. They don't believe the Bible is the word of God. And you wonder why they might use a cross as a symbol at all. They kind of kind of moved away from a traditional presentation of a Christian cross and started using like a stylized monad or something. If you
Well, right, and this is one of the,
advance the slide one more, it's a good place for us to rest. Here we go.
I haven't seen one that says all genders are whole, holy, and good. I mean, I understand the meaning of it, but that's a new one even for me.
Yeah, I get the feeling they change this pretty frequently.
Yeah,
I've seen many
you're right,
versions
of
of it
course.
myself, but the marching orders are always changing on that front, I suppose.
I'm always just
But
confused, like, what's the point of even going to church? You know, like you're effectively just a social club, but that's probably not not
well,
a particularly productive.
I looked at a Unitarian, I guess a prayer book of some sort. That they had some kind of pew book at a Unitarian church, and I flipped through it just because I was curious, and I noticed prayers by Ralph Waldo Emerson
Oh, that's interesting.
that said in church. And that's really interesting because the transcendentalist movement, the American humanists and things like that, that is an American literary tradition, and there's something of style in that body of literature, but they put it in a church pew and called it their faith. And I suppose it is a faith. This is a very politicized religion, such as it is. It was never very popular, though it does have a lot of important adherents. I'm sorry to admit that John Adams was a Unitarian. I rather like John Adams, President John Adams of Massachusetts, John Quincy Adams, and surprisingly, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina.
Oh, that's incredibly surprising.
Yeah, so there's kind of a diversity there. You know, you have some famous Southerners who are also Unitarians, but this was something that never got very far from the elites. So it looks to me like a religion of the political class, the political elites. I knew some people who became Unitarian, and they definitely wanted to think of themselves as upper crust, yet still religious, not believing any unpopular religious things to believe, only believing the most popular sorts of doctrines. At
It
least
is very,
that's one
and
way of
at
looking
least
at it.
in my personal experience, they seem to be kind of striver types. You know,
Yeah,
the kind of people who want to be as high status as possible, and it seems to be a convenient way to attach themselves to all high status beliefs at once.
yeah. You win points everywhere by saying those slogans.
Should I go to the next slide?
You don't get attacked for saying any of those things.
Right. Yes, of course. There's almost no
You say,
opposition to it.
I am with power. I agree with power. So if you advance, we'll go on to something more interesting. Okay, so the Second Great Awakening. I've looked for a more clear version of this map. I apologize. This map is kind of blurry, but it's the best map of this sort that I have. You can see this this teal area, this blue-green area. This is where most of this evangelist activity is going on. I have said before there are evangelists in the South, but they do seem to be doing something distinctly different just at the same time. In this region of the North, where most of this activity is taking place, most of the revival meetings are taking place, you see a bunch of special movements, groups springing up. You see Shaker communes here on the map. You see a few. You see a few of these red boxes. The red represents Mormon activity and Mormon communities. The red lines also illustrate the movement of the Mormons westward. course, they eventually end up in Utah, or most of them do. Also, we see other things illustrated on this map. There are some famous communes like Brook Farm in Massachusetts. Nathaniel Hawthorne was a part of that experiment. That was a vegetarian commune that tried to eliminate private property. Another thing that you see marked on the map is the Fourierist phalanxes. This is all establishments of a French utopian thinker named Fourier, and he was not a religious thinker, but he was a communist thinker. Now, this is before Karl Marx, which is important. He prefigures the communists of 1848 and the Communist Manifesto. And he was not a religious thinker, but he imagined that he could solve all the world's problems through applied reason and scientific thinking. He said there was no problem that human beings could experience that could not be reasoned to a solution. So he is a thoroughgoing rationalist, and he imagined that in the future humanity would live in gigantic communal apartment buildings. It's a very curious thing. He was a prolific writer, and he had adherents here in the United States who were very motivated by the utopian millennialist spirit of the age, and started selling all that they had to buy spots in these experimental phalanx settlements. And several of them actually built buildings and such. Some of them still exist, I understand. If you would advance, we'll continue. So another one of these utopian groups that try to get rid of all their religious ideas and focus on humanist, rationalist approaches to perfect peace and harmony and the end of evil were the followers of Robert Owen. Now, this is peculiar and interesting. We see this as an Anglo-American phenomenon. The Second Great Awakening does have its adherents over in England as well, but they find that they can get financial support, and they can get people to go in with them in communal experiments and communes here in the United States, whereas back in England, these ideas are not so popular. In the United States, there are always wealthy New Englanders who are willing to finance things like this, these utopian experiments. So Robert Owen, who is from, I want to say he's from Wales. I don't think he's from England. I think he's from Wales, but he's from the British Empire. He's from Great Britain. He comes to Indiana and he starts a commune there. Now, this has a lot in common with the Fourierist phalanxes that I just talked about. Robert Owen imagined that everyone would live in a giant apartment building. There would be no religion. It would be totally peaceful. There would be no crime, and everyone's lives would be planned, so there would be no conflict. We see this kind of thing done again and again during this period. But Owen wanted to eliminate all religious education, which is a very important aspect, and he blamed this on the failure of his commune. If you advance the slide one click, we'll see a picture of Robert Owen. There we go. Yes, he was from Wales. I remembered it right. Okay, so Robert Owen he believed that the Christian teaching of the sinfulness of man and the fall of man was actually the source of human misbehavior. And though he failed as a utopian, he became a pioneer in public education. And I I know critics of Marxism have cited Robert Owen as an inspiration to Karl Marx and his advocacy of public education. I don't know that Marx himself ever cited Robert Owen for that. But it's a coincidence anyway. Both Marx and Robert Owen both said that there should be universal public education.
Shall I go to the next slide?
Yes, go right ahead. So the Nashoba community is another small phenomenon. It did not take off, but it's another instance of an Anglo, a Scottish woman in this case, who came to the United States, found funding with American elites who were willing to fund these utopian experiments. Frances Wright went to Memphis, Tennessee, and had a lot of abolitionist goals and had a lot of abolitionist enthusiasts who were funding this effort. She went to Memphis, Tennessee. She bought a derelict plantation and began buying slaves. Now, this is a very strange thing for a radical abolitionist to do, but she intended to found a utopian community with her slaves, with the goal of making enough profit on the plantation to send them to African colonies. Now, this is a gradualist approach. This is not a radical abolitionist approach. It's a gradualist approach. What's radical is the other things that Frances Wright attempted to do with this experiment. Like Robert Owen, Frances Wright was also a radical atheist. So she attempted to get the slaves to stop practicing religion, to stop believing in Jesus. So these slaves had been in the United States for a few generations. For the most part, there are exceptions. We're talking about this period of history, but most American slaves were born into slavery. Most American slaves were not brought to the United States. The number of slaves born in the United States vastly outnumbers the number of slaves that were brought to the United States in slave transportation in the Middle Passage in the Atlantic. But Frances Wright, she attempted to de-Christianize them. This did not go over well, and it did not seem to take. At least Frances Wright did not think her efforts made much impact. Another thing that she did was she preached something that she became very infamous for on the lecture circuit. She preached free love to her slaves. She attempted to abolish marriage. Now, evidently, she had more success along these lines, but her success destroyed whatever organization she had at this experiment. The slaves all began fighting amongst themselves, and order and cohesion totally broke down at the Nashoba experiment, and the whole thing had to be dissolved. She ended up having to sell the slaves again, which was traumatic, I think, for everyone involved, including Frances Wright, by the way. I mean, she failed and realized that she became insolvent, which is why she had to turn to the auctioneer. If you advance once, you'll see a picture of Frances Wright. Here she is. She is lionized by feminists these days, is what I understand.
It's interesting because I think I've actually seen when that portrait came up. I think I've actually seen that portrait before, in college.
Really?
So I've at least seen her probably in that context, as some kind of like feminist icon.
I I actually have a scholarly interest in these things, and I'm trying to track down sources on these things. And I want to get a book of Frances Wright's lectures because I've never read them. I'm sure they're on archive.org or something, but I just haven't gone to find them. Okay, so the next group that we have is the Shakers. Now, this is a very peculiar group. They started out as a sect of the Quakers. So the Quakers, you must understand, are much older than all the other groups that we're talking about here. They do not date back to the Second Great Awakening. They're actually much older than that. And we have a lot of illustrious members of this sect. William Penn, who founds Pennsylvania, for instance. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is founded by the Quakers. The Quakers start out as kind of a Pentecostal sort of sect. They're known to have these really wild religious, emotional experiences, which is why they are called Quakers. They would quake. Their bodies would shake in religious ecstasy, which is why they earned that name. They called themselves the Society of Friends. Now, though they started out with this Pentecostal sort of experience, they became quietist over time. So the Quaker service did not involve any leaders. These people denied all social hierarchy. So there was no leader of the Quakers, at least in theory. They had no pastors. In the Quaker meeting, the men and women would separate, kind of as you see here in this illustration. They would separate in the Quaker meeting house, the men on one side, the women on the other, and they would sit down quietly. There was no order of service. There were no prayers. There were no creeds. There was no Bible reading. Until someone felt motivated to get up and say something. And sometimes in a Quaker meeting, no one would say anything, and eventually everyone would go home. They had no symbolism, no art. Quakers do not display the cross. They do not practice baptism. They do not believe in the Trinity. So Quakers, though they are older than these groups, we should see immediately these are very radical, non-traditional Christians at best. I do not think that you could say that anyone who denies the deity of Christ and the Trinity of God can be a Christian.
I actually have some experience with current day Quakers, and it's interesting because they have effectively left behind the concept of God altogether. They refer to the light, and when the light leaves you, you can speak in their service, and otherwise it's just dead silent the whole time. And it's interesting because it just so happens that that God happens to listen to a lot of NPR, and so that's or the light rather, and that tends to be what comes up in services. But anyway, you were saying.
Well, the Shakers are distinct from the Quakers. The Quakers find shelter in their colony here in the United States. Everywhere else the Quakers go, they meet with persecution, but this involves their radical belief against all hierarchical institutions. So people that convert to Quakerism disrespect their parents and get thrown out of their homes, can't abide with their family members anymore. They attack public officials and say, you have no right to make rulings on anything. You have no right to judge anything. You have no right to make laws on anything because everyone is equal. Which ought to sound familiar to us. I think that it was Curtis Yarvin who claimed that Quakerism is the official religion of the United States. And I have always loved that remark. That has always struck me as true somehow, because they do, just as you say, they talk about the light that leads every believer to his own vision of goodness or truth. So it's a very personalized, individualized sort of experience with Quakers. But all that to say, the Shakers, they split from the Quakers. The Shakers are founded by a woman that calls herself Mother Ann Lee. Now, she is another Britisher, like William Penn. She comes to America from England, and she is a curious figure. Evidently, she had a very terrible marriage, and was something of a mystic and a strange person, like a non-traditional sort of woman or wife, and eventually gets rid of her husband. She separates from her husband after having several children that die very early. So she experiences pregnancy and birth. Her children die. This seems very traumatic for her, and she has visions and mystical experiences, and she begins teaching in the Quaker meeting house, where women are allowed to get up and speak, where women preach. This is something the Quakers are very famous for. This is a very controversial thing. And Mother Ann Lee proclaims to her followers that Christ has already come back, that Christ has returned to earth, that the kingdom of heaven is now, and that no one is to be married anymore, and no one is to own anything anymore, and that they are going to live a serene life with no evil. And she also teaches, as opposed to the quietist mode of the Quakers, where they just sit in silence, she teaches ritual dancing. So the Shakers, people that join this sect, are known to dance ritually together. Now, this becomes very popular during the Second Great Awakening. Mother Ann Lee lives well before the Second Great Awakening and dies here in America. But the Shaker sect only finds an audience during the Second Great Awakening, and it becomes a popular commune. And unlike the other communes, like the Owenites in the Nashoba community and the phalanxes that are set up here and there, the Shakers actually make a go at this. It seems to be a successful experiment, at least while these people live. This is an example of a Shaker village. You may have encountered Shaker style furniture. That comes from the Shakers. They invented that style. Here is a Shaker workshop. You can see that they have very minimalist sort of approach, which corresponds to their Quaker heritage, which is very minimalist. You can see the chairs on the walls here. These communities are now empty because the Shakers all forswore marriage to join these communes. They did not marry. They did not have children. Their only way to keep their sect going was to recruit from the outside. And after a certain point, no one was interested in joining anymore. They basically lived a monastic existence. You can see they did have really remarkable craftsmanship and grace in the things that they built. Another funny little point about the Shakers, they were the first people to be granted a conscientious objector status. When Lincoln was looking for soldiers for his war, he did not try recruiting amongst the Quakers, who were all pacifists, strict pacifists and refused to fight. And this is the origin of the conscientious objector status in the United States military.
So this is actually my favorite part of this lecture. And even though it's been, I guess, the best part of a decade now, I remember this community in particular. It's just one that always sticks in my brain. But anyway, why don't you introduce them?
Yes, indeed. This is usually the favorite of my high school students. So the Oneida Community was founded in 1848. Coincidentally, the year the Communist Manifesto is published, 1848. Such an eventful year. It's founded by John Humphrey Noyes, who is from Brattleboro, Vermont, so southern Vermont. John Humphrey Noyes goes to Harvard. He meets William Lloyd Garrison. So his career begins as a radical among the radicals. He is a very vocal abolitionist in Boston. And he's friends with William Lloyd Garrison, who spends the rest of his life doing this kind of agitation. But Noyes decides to return to Vermont. He studies theology in college. And when he goes back to Vermont, he starts publishing a newspaper. Now, it's really strange. People in this day read huge amounts of material, even compared to our set. I'm just dumbfounded at the number of newspapers and the fact that people could write so much as to publish a newspaper just blows my mind. But he publishes a newspaper and kind of lives on the income for a while, which is also just stupendous. Like, there are people wanting to buy his writing. Like, everyone wants to buy reading material everywhere, even crackpot reading material like from John Humphrey Noyes. He becomes known as a perfectionist and preaches the novel doctrine that Christians can do no evil. Rather like the Shakers, John Humphrey Noyes also believes that the kingdom of God is now. We aren't anticipating it. It is right now. And that true Christians commit no sin at all. Hence his moniker, perfectionism. Now, he has two close friends, a young couple, and a third man. I believe this is how the story goes. So he has like two other men and one married woman in his set, who is married to one of these men. The woman ends up having an affair with the single man in his little sect. Now, at this point, he has a church of 4. Okay, so he has a very, very small group, but he's still publishing this newspaper, publicizing his ideas. John Humphrey Noyes says, well, no one here has done anything wrong. We are all members of this perfect church, and this is not adultery. But he also realizes this presents a unique problem. So he formulates a new doctrine called complex marriage. Now, obviously, the woman's husband is not okay with his wife having this affair. She assures him that everything is fine because she's a perfect Christian. And he should not feel so bad about this, that he might be in sin for feeling bad about this. John Humphrey Noyes sides with her and says, you should not feel any jealousy. That is evil, to feel jealousy. Christians should not feel jealousy anymore. And so he comes up with his doctrine of complex marriage. In the perfectionist church of John Humphrey Noyes, all adult men are married to all adult women. Now, that doesn't mean that they just swap partners every night. No. John Humphrey Noyes must choose all the couplings. So John Humphrey Noyes ends up coming up with a complex system of eugenics to purify the breed in his church. So dysgenic members, ugly people, unattractive people, less intelligent people, do not get to procreate. John Humphrey Noyes preaches his position of complex marriage, along with a teaching of male continence, which we need not elaborate on. Basically, the men needed permission to participate in an act that could be procreative. And once he had formulated this eugenics philosophy, John Humphrey Noyes was known to be very popular amongst the new female recruits.
Of course, right?
Yes. So this is a very strange story because he had a certain kind of popularity. They were chased out of Vermont when it became public that his group was engaged in wife swapping, basically. He was chased out of Vermont with threats of violence. He went to the town of Oneida, New York, which I think is in the Hudson River Valley. I think it is. I think it's near Syracuse, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, they bought land, and one of his new recruits to his church was the owner of a small industrial concern. So the whole community, his church community, built a manor house to live in. They all lived in the same house. Again, this idea of the future of humanity in a humanist socialist harmony, everyone living in giant apartment buildings together, renovating the sexual mores, renovating their vision of private property or doing away with their vision of private property. They found prosperity in this industrial concern. They actually made a fortune manufacturing and selling animal traps. So like beaver traps and things like that. That was their original thing. But they got to manufacturing flatware and dishes eventually. If you advance the slide. This is a photograph of the Oneida community. So Oneida is still known as a manufacturer of flatware and such. But this cult did not survive the death of John Humphrey Noyes. After his death, people kind of they took the stock in this corporation that they were a part of. They took dividends from it, but they stopped practicing this religion. Interestingly, John Humphrey Noyes' own son called himself an atheist and grew up in this community and was not ostracized for his avowed atheism. But by the time he was more or less left in charge of the thing, he dissolved it. The religious component did not survive a generation. But the corporation survived the religion, which is also curious.
Shall I go to the next one?
Go right ahead. We find a bunch of radical vegetarian evangelists during this time, which I'm very amused with. One of the most famous is Dr. Sylvester Graham. Dr. Graham was interested in two things that he made a great deal of during his life. Firstly, he preached far and wide on the dangers of masturbation. So that was one of his first pet peeves. The second was he believed that all human cuisines were wrong. Everyone in the world was eating wrong. And if people would simply adopt a pure grain-based vegetarian diet, then we could eliminate a substantial amount of evil from the world. So Dr. Graham was something of a granola fanatic. And that's actually where granola comes from. It comes from vegetarian evangelist preachers who combined religious fervor and the gospel with their dietary ideas. Something all Americans should recognize as commonplace. This is a very American phenomenon to pick up radical new diets as a pseudo-religious fad. It's a very American thing to do. We live in it, and we don't necessarily realize that's kind of strange, but it strikes other people from other parts of the world as strange. And I enjoy seeing that as strange. I want to think I've come out of that. I don't live in that world, but Dr. Graham, he founded the American Vegetarian Society. He preached against the use of coffee, tea, tobacco, and milk. It's very interesting. And he popularized the use of a very special flour made of whole grain for his followers. And what's very interesting is Dr. Graham's special diet did not survive, but his special flour survived. The graham cracker is an American thing that came out of this movement. And of course, none of us eat graham crackers thinking of the weird religious sect that spawned it, but nevertheless, it did come from Dr. Graham. You may continue. All right, the Millerites. This is another fun group. William Miller was a Baptist pastor. He published tracts like you see here, popularized these things. William Miller, after long study of the Bible, decided that he knew the day and the hour that Christ would return. So he said the end of the world would take place in 1843, I believe.
1833, according to your slides, but
maybe I got that wrong.
Because it's 1843 in this newspaper clipping, so it must just be wrong on the slide.
Maybe it's wrong in the slide. My mistake there. I'll have to touch that up. So William Miller encouraged his followers, based on his mathematical work with the Old Testament, he encouraged his followers to sell everything that they had, dress in white robes, and go to a high place, a hilltop, so that they could watch the return of Christ in the sky and watch the judgment of wicked humanity. And they would see the establishment of the new heaven and the new earth. So this was known as the Great Disappointment, ironically, by detractors who came up with this term for this day. Millerites mostly in New York, which is where this movement was most popular. New York, Ohio, Vermont, Massachusetts. It kind of spans that area. They sold all that they had. They were preaching to their neighbors to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. They're using lots of biblical injunctions. They go up onto hilltops and nothing happens. And their disbelieving neighbors mock them for it. Now, surprisingly, this is not the end of the Millerites. William Miller says, "Oh, well, I got it wrong by a year." And some go up to the hilltop the next year. But again, nothing happens. They do not see the judgment of humanity. And once again, they are disgraced. But rather than disband this movement, Miller's followers develop something new and something lasting. They develop a denomination, if you will, that is still with us today, the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, William Miller does not come up with many of the peculiar teachings of this group. It is his followers who come up with many of these peculiar teachings. In particular, another woman mystic. There are a number of female mystics that are involved in the foundation of these groups. And I forget this woman's name, but she sees a vision of the Ten Commandments. And it's based on this vision that the Seventh-day Adventists worship on Saturday instead of Sunday.
Her name was Ellen Gould White.
There we go. There we go. One of their prophetesses. So she popularizes this new practice that they should keep the Jewish Sabbath. And Seventh-day Adventists have many dietary restrictions because they attempt to follow Jewish dietary practices. They attempt to keep kosher. Now, because Seventh-day Adventists are not in urban areas, typically, they tend to be in rural areas in the countryside. They frequently just practice vegetarianism rather than attempt to find kosher prepared foods. But because they are so invested in a special practice of food, the Seventh-day Adventists started food companies. So Dr. Kellogg of Battle Creek, Michigan, a follower of Dr. Graham up in Connecticut, Dr. Kellogg becomes a Seventh-day Adventist and invents the cornflake. Now, Dr. Kellogg is also following some Grahamite ideas. In addition to being a Seventh-day Adventist, Dr. Kellogg is also a vegan, like Dr. Graham was. So Dr. Kellogg invents the cornflake as a breakfast cereal. He imagines and teaches. Now, this is not what Seventh-day Adventists claim. But this has more in common with what Dr. Graham claimed. But Kellogg believes if he can change the American diet to make it vegetarian, one meal a day, that he could mathematically reduce the amount of evil in the world by 1/3. So he popularized his cornflakes, and this is one of the reasons why Americans have two visions of breakfast food. We have the cereal, thanks to Dr. Kellogg, the cereal breakfast. Now, Dr. Kellogg, being a vegan, would not suggest milk with this. He wanted people to eat it with water. But Americans have more taste than that, and so we eat the cereal with milk, of course. But that was Dr. Kellogg's idea. Another famous Seventh-day Adventist food maker is the founders of Little Debbie cakes, which are made according to Jewish ceremonial law, strangely enough, because they're Seventh-day Adventists. I think the writers of the epistles would call them Judaizers.
Are we ready to go on to the next one?
Yes, go right ahead. Right, another unusual group here is the Christian Scientists, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, who was from New Hampshire. Mary Baker Eddy started a franchise of health spas. These are what is the word I'm looking for? They're kind of like resorts, asylums, an asylum might be the word I'm looking for. It doesn't sound quite right. Anyway,
Sanitarium?
there we go, a sanitarium. Sorry for that. My brain just stopped working. Sanitarium sorts of organizations where people would go for rest cures. She was a student of innovative interpretations of the Bible. She ends up writing this book, Science and Health. Now, if you look carefully at this, you can see she wrote the book before she was married. The name on the book is Glover. She was Mary Baker Glover Eddy. So she married Mr. Eddy and took the name Eddy. But she wrote this book, Science and Health as a Key to the Scriptures. Mary Baker Eddy is what we would call a Gnostic. She believed that the physical world was an illusion. We do not have bodies, according to Miss Eddy. The physical world does not exist. Therefore, if you have an ailment in your body, you need to believe that your body is not real, that you are actually a healthy Christian soul. Now, to be a Christian in Miss Eddy's formulation means to deny the incarnation of our Lord. She did not believe that Christ had a body either. Okay, so this is not traditional Christianity at all. This is Gnosticism. This is something that was condemned in the first century by the Apostolic Fathers. The denial of the incarnation is one of the earliest Christian heresies. But Mary Baker Eddy was a Gnostic. She denied the incarnation, and she said that all cures were based in faith. So you just had to believe properly, and you would feel no pain, and presumably experience no evil. If you advance and take a look at Christian Science reading rooms, this is what they call the Mother Church. This is the largest of the Christian Science reading rooms. It's in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where it is based. This had its day, I think. They do not publicize the numbers of their members, but it really does seem to be in sharp decline at this point. Lots of Christian Science reading rooms have closed and been converted into Christian churches, usually. But one thing that you note here is the lack of symbolism, the centrality of a podium for a speaker. This is a very intellectual experience, and that is something that you can recognize about the Christian Scientists, founded as they were in New England. They correspond to the Puritan tradition of religion as an intellectual exercise, minimizing the importance of sacraments, say, which Puritans were very, very focused on the sermon.
Sorry, the way by which you go through slides on StreamYards is a little messy. Okay, we should be good. Sorry about that.
No trouble. All right, now we get to our final experience in this overview, and that is the Mormons. They are certainly the largest, most important product of the Second Great Awakening, perhaps the most important American-made religious innovation. Now, of course, the Mormons are all over the world, based in the most unusual place, based over in Utah. They're running a kind of global church now, and it's such a unique story. It does merit some in-depth storytelling here. The Mormon church is called Mormons by outsiders. the adherents to this church call it the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is founded by the LDS prophet founder Joseph Smith of Vermont, another New Englander we see. Joseph Smith starts out a very interesting career. He's very interested in divining rods. So he has magical sticks that he uses to find things buried in the ground. Now, this is a very interesting practice. I don't know the origins of it. This is presumably something very old. I had a relation that used divining rods to find oil and gas down here in Louisiana. And he was one of my favorite relatives. I really love this guy. He was a real character. I love my Uncle Joe. He tried getting in touch with me right before he died, and I still regret that I didn't reconnect with him. I didn't know that he was about to die, obviously, but I loved that guy. But anyway, there are other people that do stuff with divining rods. But Joseph Smith had a reputation for looking for buried treasure. He lived in what is called the Burned Over District. Now, this is this area of intense reformist activity during the Second Great Awakening. You have lots of abolitionist radicals that are starting churches in the name of abolitionist politics. You have Millerites. You have Utopian communes and all sorts of curious things going on. Joseph Smith writes a very interesting introduction to the Book of Mormon, which is worth your time. I take this man seriously, and I don't know what's going on with him. I am not a Mormon, and I'm not sympathetic to Mormon theology. I categorically reject it. But that does not mean that I think Joseph Smith was a liar. And I would beg your indulgence on the seeming paradox of that. I happen to believe people can have mystical experiences, and that not all mystical experiences come from God. Okay, they can come from lying spirits too, which is why Christians are commanded to test the spirits and not found their own religions and such. Christians aren't allowed to do that. But Joseph Smith writes about growing up in Western New York State and going to revival meetings. And he writes very sincerely about this, that it made him very confused, and it made his neighbors very confused. Smith says that after years of revivalist meetings and the foundations of various churches that claim different doctrines and different practices, he was left thinking that religion was discredited, that religion was not something for serious people, that Christianity was a confused mess. And this is, I think, a good capstone to our investigation here, because what are the results of these things? I think it does discredit faith. I think it does discredit faithful people. It does discredit religious tradition as such. Even though it is a modernist thing, it's built in a rejection of tradition, we might say. That's another critique, that it's not actually traditional at all. But Joseph Smith's observation is, I think, very sincere and important. In these circumstances, Joseph Smith says that he received a vision of God. Eventually, I think first it is an angel named Moroni who speaks to him, and then God the Father and God the Son speak to him. Now, in the Mormon understanding, There is no Trinity. These people do not believe in the Trinity of God. They believe that Jesus is the literal Son of God the Father through a female who is spiritual, I believe. Not, it is not, they aren't talking about the Virgin Mary in this context. It is something else. Anyway, this is a Mormon artwork of the young Joseph Smith conversing with God the Father and God the Son. He receives in these visions instruction that the church, the Christian church, has gone wrong ever since the time of the apostles. So all of Western Christianity is wrong. That the church ceased to exist. The Church of Christ, founded at Pentecost, ceased to exist, according to the Mormons. This means that the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Lutherans, the Baptists, they're all wrong. None of them understand the Bible correctly. None of them are practicing the religion of Christ. And Joseph Smith is appointed to restore the Church of Christ in America. And he's to do this with a particular American source. So the angel Moroni leads Joseph Smith to a hilltop in Vermont, in southern Vermont, where is buried golden plates inscribed with something Joseph Smith describes as Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics. This is the site in southern Vermont. This is the hill where the Mormons have built a monument to commemorate the finding of the Book of Mormon by Joseph Smith. Now, this is a very interesting document, or it portends to be a historical ancient document. Joseph Smith said that this was the record of Jews who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean before Christ and had established a pre-Columbian continental civilization in what is now the United States, and had been utterly exterminated to a man by the people who are now Native Americans. So there were no Jews left in America by the time Columbus and the Anglo colonists arrive. All right. He's not saying that Native Americans are Jews, though Native Americans have always had the Mormons have always been very interested in Native Americans for this reason. The Book of Mormon is the record of the last Mormon, or the last Jewish patriarch whose name is Mormon. He writes the story of his people and buries it. Now, what makes this of particular importance, not only are these Jewish people, but Christ visited them. The Mormons believe Christ had a ministry in Palestine and that Christ had a ministry in America to his Jewish tribes here in what is now the United States. So Christ had two ministries on earth, according to the Mormons. And that's why they call the Book of Mormon another gospel of Jesus Christ. They claim it is a lost gospel. If you advance, so with the Book of Mormon, which is inscribed on golden plates, so this is like a book with metal pages. Okay, here is an artistic portrayal of what Mormons think it looked like. All right. He finds as well the Urim and the. Now I'm going to get this wrong. I'm remembering it, but I don't know the word. The Urim and the Thummim These are biblical artifacts. So the Old Testament mentions the priesthood of Israel having stones that they use in a kind of ritual. They can use these stones to detect the guilt or innocence of someone accused of a crime, for instance. This is all in the Mosaic Law. So this is in the Old Testament. Joseph Smith claims that he recovered those stones with the Book of Mormon on the hilltop in Vermont. He also claims that he found a breastplate that the stones are attached to. Now, I like this portrayal right here. Joseph Smith did not give us an illustration of these things, not to my knowledge anyway. I'm not aware of that for sure, but I don't think he did. I think this right here, this is a modern Mormon artistic expression of what they believe Joseph Smith found with the Book of Mormon. What this is magical eyeglasses that translate the reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics in the metal plates that he found. The Mormons say Joseph Smith translated the book that they call the Book of Mormon in this manner. He publishes this book I think he translates it in northern Pennsylvania. He publishes it in western New York as another gospel of Jesus Christ and starts a new church, a restorationist cult, if you will, cult meaning a following. With this movement and in his adherents, he moves westward. First, he goes to northern Ohio, a place settled mostly with New Englanders. The same area where you find Oberlin College, actually. This is an area that's very important in the Second Great Awakening. But he keeps getting chased away because this is a very radical preaching or teaching that he has. He goes to Missouri. He claims that Independence, Missouri, which is right beside Kansas City, is going to be a capital in some spiritual sense for America, but is unable to stay in Missouri. He faces major backlash and persecution from the Missourians. There are a lot of stories of these Mormon missionaries, these Mormon evangelists, getting very hostile receptions in these frontier communities. But Joseph Smith ends up in a town called Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, he founds this town. He names it Nauvoo, Nauvoo. And it is on the Mississippi River. And it's kind of at the corner of Missouri, Iowa, and Illinois. So it's rather near Hannibal, Missouri, and is it Moline, Illinois, up that way? It's rather close, or Quincy, Illinois. Quincy, Illinois is one of those towns. It's on the Mississippi River. They build a town there. They build a temple there. I think this is their second temple. And Joseph Smith proclaims two very interesting things. First, he says that God wants all Mormon men to practice polygamy. And Joseph Smith, according to some accounts, there is controversy on this point, and this is a very interesting controversy. I don't really know what it's about. There's controversy about how many wives Joseph Smith ended up taking. One group of Mormons, those that follow the son of Joseph Smith, deny that he ever claimed a teaching of polygamy. and that he ever married anyone but his first wife, which is a really wild claim. The Mormons in Utah, which are the predominant Mormon sect, they're overwhelmingly the largest Mormon sect, they claim that Joseph Smith married dozens of women. And this is a really peculiar story. How did he manage to do this? He did this mostly in secret, but the teaching of the Mormons and their practice of polygamy becomes known. The second thing that he does is he runs for president of the United States. Mormons believe that the United States of America is a providential organization that is put together and contains divine intent, that America is literally a nation chosen by God to work God's will on earth. The Mormons believe that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are divinely inspired. And this is a very important thing. This has gone to serve Mormons very well in modern times. I understand Mormons are great favorites of the FBI and the CIA. They like to recruit among them because they believe that they are serving God by serving the United States government in some way. Anyway, Joseph Smith, while he's running for president, he is lynched in Illinois. So Joseph Smith, he forms a militia in Nauvoo that destroys the press of a paper criticizing Joseph Smith and the Mormons. Rather than run from the warrant issued to him for doing this, the charge is treason against the state of Illinois, because he has formed a militia and commanded a military formation to carry out an act of violence in the state of Illinois. That's treason against the state of Illinois. He is usurping the role of the governor, who has the sole authority to command military forces in Illinois. So Joseph Smith decides to turn himself in to the authorities. He goes to the local magistrate, who has a jail building, and a lynch mob shows up. Joseph Smith is there with his brother, Hiram Smith, who is one of his key lieutenants. He does everything with Hiram. And the lynch mob attacks the jail. Joseph Smith and Hiram are both armed. So this is a very interesting thing. They aren't locked in a cell here. The magistrate knows that a mob is out for blood, and he's actually trying to protect them. And Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith fight the mob through a door, and in the process, both of them are shot. I believe Hiram is shot in the face, and Joseph Smith is shot elsewhere on his body. Joseph Smith then jumps out the window, where he is shot several more times and succumbs. So this here is a Mormon monument by the jail where the lynching took place, and this is a statue of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Now, this is something, as a history guy in 2023, I have a certain appreciation for the Mormons for getting behind their own people 100%. Mormons have repudiated their doctrine of polygamy, though they do not deny that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were polygamists, and their forefathers were polygamists. They don't deny it, but they don't practice it anymore. But that doesn't mean that they don't like these people. And they're controversial people. that do things that Americans traditionally found distasteful and dreadful and wicked. And yet Mormons do not back down. And they like their own people. And I like that. And I wish that other Americans had more of that themselves. I think that's a healthy attitude in spite of all the weird and untrue things Mormons believe. I really appreciate this about them. So after the death of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young becomes the leader of the Mormons. Young is he presides over a kind of church split at the death of Joseph Smith. Young is one of Smith's lieutenants, and Young decides to abandon Nauvoo, Illinois, the town that the Mormons built. At one time, it was one of the largest cities on the Mississippi River. It was like it wasn't as big as Chicago. It never was as big as Chicago, but at one point it was like the second largest city in Illinois, is what I want to say. Young decides to abandon this. He decides to send a lot of missionaries to England, where they recruit lots of new converts. And he decides to move westward to the Great Desert beyond the mountains. And so Young travels to what is now Utah and founds Salt Lake City, Utah, as the new center of the Mormon people. They're going to get far away from these hostile Protestants back east. This is a really remarkable story because they go to Utah, which is a very, very forbidding landscape. Young says, "This is the place," which I think is like the slogan of Utah today. And they build Salt Lake City. And this is a very urban environment, which is also very curious. Utah is the most heavily urbanized state in the United States today. Young brings his English converts all the way from England, all the way out there to the desert. They transport their belongings in things like wheelbarrows. They don't even have wagons for this trek. They walk all the way to Utah. Young marries dozens of women. This is his house complex. They have several names. One is called the Beehive House. One is called the Lion House. Now, something interesting about Young, he was married when he converted to Mormonism and became an apostle of Joseph Smith. That's his official title, by the way. They have the Council of the 12 Apostles. These are restored apostolic chairs. Catholic and Orthodox listeners would immediately hone in on that and go, "Oh, okay. The apostolic seats cease to exist. They're all vacant, and Joseph Smith filled them. He restored them." There's a certain recognition that we have there. Anyway, his first wife always had predominance. Young's first wife had her very own house, and all the other wives lived in other houses. One of these houses is rather like a dormitory, okay, where every wife has her own little living area, her own little apartment that she lives in. But Young's first wife was always the head wife. So there's a certain similarity there to the complex marriages in the Kingdom of Siam, or in a sheik's harem or something, or in the caliph's boudoir, or whatever, wherever the Muslims and pagans keep their wives. There is a head wife. There's a wife with predominance. And the Mormons adopted that practice too. Polygamy has worked. And it has worked in America in the sense that it was part of a successful social construction, a new society, a new community in which polygamy was at the top and widespread within. It's a very strange story. Eventually, of course, we know the Mormons do give up that teaching, and we might call them Orthodox Mormons today, do not practice polygamy. It is fundamentalist sectarians in Mormonism that practice polygamy today in America and elsewhere. There are oddball Mormon polygamists. The Mormons build temples around Utah. These are two examples. On the right, you see the main temple in Salt Lake City that was built by Young. On the left, you see a smaller temple in St. George, Utah. These are unusual constructions. There are American art students that specialize in the oddity of this architecture. Just where does this architecture come from? This is a curious thing. The Mormons do not always meet in temples. There are a limited number of Mormon temples, and certain Mormon rites and rituals can only be performed in a temple. So Mormons make pilgrimages, if you will, to regional temples. Unsurprisingly, most of these temples are in Utah, but there are temples spread around the world at this point.
Yeah, prominently, there's one near DC, which if you've ever driven, I believe it's 95. When you drive from Maryland into DC, you can see kind of like the top spire of the Mormon temple.
And those spires frequently have the Mormon emblem on it, the symbol usually done in a little gold statue of an angel blowing on a horn. And that is the symbol of the angel Moroni, who first appeared to Joseph Smith. So as the story goes, an American angel that reveals the doctrines of Mormonism. This is a photograph from the interior of a Mormon temple. I know this is a very strange sight for most of us, but this is actually an Old Testament image. This is something that's copied from what we see for the designs of the temple in Jerusalem. Or is it the tabernacle? Is it the design for the tabernacle? There is a great basin that is described in the Old Testament. Is it the Bronze Sea? Is that what
I
the
believe
King
so. The
James
bronze
version?
basin. I can't remember the exact word to describe it, but isn't it a basin for ritual purification of the priests? Am I correct in
That
that?
is correct. Yes, it's for the Jewish priesthood to purify themselves, and this bronze basin is on the backs of a number of oxen. I forget what number it is, but that's what you're seeing here. This is actually an image that you see in the Old Testament that the Mormons restored to usage in their religious practices. And this operates as a baptismal font for them. Mormons practice the baptism of the dead. So they believe that through proxy baptism of the Mormon faithful, Mormon faithful being baptized in the names of people who are dead can restore those people spiritually and make them members of the Mormon church. And for this reason, Mormons have the most amazing knowledge of genealogy perhaps anyone has ever accomplished in all of history. They've devoted great resources to this because this is a religious tenet for them. And they're interested in saying the names of every person who has ever lived in proxy baptisms and in keeping these names. So they've built doomsday vaults to store the names of baptized Mormons, presumably the vast majority of whom are long dead, and they've been baptized in a proxy baptism. So people converted to Mormonism will try to find the names of all of their ancestors in order to participate in proxy baptisms for all of their forebears. I've described all of this as restorationism, the idea that the church founded by Christ and the apostles ceased to exist at some point in history and must be refounded. So that's what this is all based in. One last Mormon story, and we will conclude. On his way out west, Brigham Young had several church splits along the way. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with Young's leadership, and the most amusing of these stories, at least to me, is that of James Strang. James Strang was a follower of Joseph Smith, a disciple of Young, who left Young on their movement westward. And interestingly, Strang denied that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. He said that Young, by making Smith's teaching public, which is what Young claimed to have done, Strang said that he was departing from this teaching of Joseph Smith. And so Strang claimed to represent the true teaching of Joseph Smith and led a faction away from Young. They went to Beaver Island, Michigan, in the middle of Lake Michigan. This is an island in the north of Lake Michigan, so it's near Wisconsin, I suppose, and started his own Utopian commune on Beaver Island. He claimed he was king. He was crowned on Beaver Island by his followers. He then proclaimed polygamy. Now, this is very amusing because he split from Young because Strang said polygamy was not a true Mormon teaching and practice. But when he became the leader of his own group, he proclaimed a teaching of polygamy. He claimed that he found his own golden plates and he published them. And he was elected to the state legislature of Michigan, which is all very delightful. It is a wonderful
Is that the
story.
only self-proclaimed king to ever sit in the Michigan state legislature?
Maybe so. It's the only one I know of in America. But
We need more kings in
love
government.
these. Yes. I think this is so delightful because he would serve as an elected representative. He had some accomplishments in organizing regional governmental authority in Michigan. His goal seems to be the autonomy of Beaver Island in the state of Michigan. That seems to be his practical purpose. But he ended up doing a lot to organize county government, I believe, in Michigan. And he's still known for that in Michigan, which is delightful. I don't know much about Michigan, but maybe this guy deserves to be on a future currency of the state of Michigan, or needs some statues in Michigan or something like that. But his story has a shocking end. Being isolated out on this island, Mr. Strang, King Strang, would get on ships very frequently. And this was a place where his enemies knew that they could find him. So he would go back and forth from the island to the mainland. And one day, his enemies jumped him. Now, these were members of his church who assassinated him. And very strangely, they were never prosecuted for the crime. There were dozens of witnesses that saw them jump out and shoot James Strang while he was walking down the gangplank to the ship in the harbor at Beaver Island. So there was no shortage of witnesses. But the assailants were brought to the mainland by a Navy cutter that was in port at the time. So the Navy brought these people to the magistrate. The magistrate released them on a trivial bail, and the community on the mainland then threw them a celebratory dinner. And they never faced charges for the murder of James Strang.
That's hilarious. I had no idea about that.
Yes, this is like a judicially approved murder.
Well, see, there's a difference between like what the Antifa types mean when they say community policing and what community policing actually turns into.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Lynch's law is an old American tradition. People think Lynch's law is all about racial animus, but there are so many examples to the contrary. I always tell my students about racial lynching, but I tell them so many stories like this that have nothing to do with race at all, and say, well, this is an example. Sometimes people just really want to kill, and they take the law into their own hands, and this happens many times in American history.
Right. So I think we have one more slide.
Yes, I think so. So in review, what can we learn from this? I think that we can recognize that a lot of these innovations are still very much with us. We see lots of connections with modern progressive ideas in the Second Great Awakening. We see the Second Great Awakening inspired people to a sort of fanaticism born of religious conviction. A fanatic is someone who redoubles their efforts when the goal has been lost, the goal has been forgotten. So a fanatic ends up working against his own goals by increasing the enthusiasm with which he pursues them. We see this in American politics. We certainly see it in the run-up right before the Civil War with people like John Brown, the terrorist. We see like religious ideas about aberrant sexual behavior, like novel religious sanctions for aberrant sexual behavior, which is certainly still with us. Anytime we hear, transsexualism is holy or something like that, our ears should perk up. This is something that has been part of American religious rhetoric for a long time. We didn't focus so much about this in our presentation today, but there is a lot of interest in race and racial relations in many of these movements, especially the humanist communes. We see that in particular with people like the Shakers, who want racial harmony. This is one of the things that they preach. The Quakers and Shakers both talk about the universal brotherhood of man, and that's something that they elevate highly in their religious rhetoric. Again, making me think that the way that those ideas have gone so mainstream as to be counted as doctrine and indisputable by otherwise Orthodox Christians, small o Orthodox Christians in America today, shows just how far those Quaker and Shaker ideas have gone in our religious beliefs in America or in the West. There's a lot of interest in economic inequality and trying to rectify that with Christian socialism, as Finney's critics termed it. Most disturbingly, a obviously a willingness to abandon all manner of orthodox dogma and practice for temporal political goals. Finally, I want to reiterate these radical religious innovations were almost exclusively confined to the North, to the point that Southern writers on religion and politics, people like the Presbyterian R.L. Dabney, who ended his life teaching at Hampton-Sydney College in Farmville, Virginia. R.L. Dabney said that this was all examples of the Northern religious tradition. This was where Northern religious belief led inexorably. And he roundly damned it and cursed it frequently. He's very colorful in that. Other Southern theologians, James Henley Thornwell, other interesting writers, defenders of Southern institutions, defenders of Southern politics, defenders of the institution of slavery, people like George Fitzhugh, also had a lot to say about this. They were saying, well, these Northerners are doing all sorts of crazy things. They're saying that it's evil to eat meat. They're saying that everyone should live in an urban apartment house as like a religious tenet. This is impossible in the imagination of Southerners at this time in history, where practically no one lives in a city. They aren't centralized, they're spread out. They don't want to participate in an industrial economy. And they're very suspicious of charismatic personalities starting innovative cult movements. Southerners at this point in history do not go in on that. Now, much has changed since then, and I think the South has become much more Americanized since then. But this is the American scene just at the cusp of the Civil War, and I do think it has a lot to do with how the war develops. Where does the war come from? In part, it is religious differences.
Well, again, right? It's so easy. Excuse me, I had to take a moment to cough. It's very easy to kind of look at, the war between the states as a purely economic affair, or as this like moral crusade of, like proto-Nazis against, the good, the good and the true and the beautiful, right? But really, it was
the anti-racist fanatics from Oberlin College versus the proto-Nazi Southerners, right?
Right, exactly. But really, it was two civilizations with just fundamentally different beliefs, different religions, different ways of ordering society. And I mean, it's really no surprise that those couldn't exist alongside, at least like based on kind of like the conditions at the time, right? Those two things could not be married together, at least in the way that, the Northerners wanted it to be.
There's growing conviction, especially in the North, but strangely also with legal minds in the South, that could not permit diversity of institutions, diversity of beliefs in one union anymore. I think it worked for a time. States had different established churches, in spite of all of our talk about the separation of church and state. The First Amendment bans Congress from establishing a national church. It does not do anything to prohibit a state from doing so. And so I know Massachusetts and Georgia, for instance, both of them had established churches after the ratification of the Constitution. That is federalism. That's what Americans meant back when they adopted the Constitution by a federal government, that the states could be different from each other. They could have different economies. They could have different populations, right? Tiny little Delaware has 2 senators, and so does mighty, huge New York. They're equal in the Senate. States are different from each other in size, different in population, but the same in some federal way. Equal representation in some way. They could have been different from each other. They could have developed differently. But at some point, they became more alike, and this upset people on both sides. Northerners wanted common values on things like slavery. They eventually coalesced about that and said, we want to abolish slavery. And they didn't want to allow for diversity on that opinion. It's not something that one can compromise on. You either have slavery or you don't. There's no middle way. The Republican Party initially ran against what they said in their platform, those 2 relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. They actually ran against Mormon polygamy. They wanted to outlaw Mormon polygamy as well as slavery. They weren't going to let the Mormons be different out in Utah. The Mormons had to be made the same. This is what Lincoln said. He said that this country cannot remain half slave and half free. It must become all one thing or all the other. And that's a nationalist sort of idea. And Southerners, or at least Southern jurists, were responsible for the Dred Scott decision, which Northerners feared would destroy all prohibitions on slavery in the North. The Dred Scott decision destroyed the Missouri Compromise, which divided the sections into slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. And that was a kind of a broken compromise and a broken protection that the Northerners thought was protecting them from the expansion of slavery. In one sense, you could say both Southerners and Northerners had gotten to a point where they were uncomfortable in a union that would have those things in common. They became points on which no one was comfortable in agreeing to permit those things.
All right. I think, George, we're kind of reaching the end of my endurance. At least you've been here for 2.5 hours, which is quite long for my show. So do you mind if I move on to super chats? And if you guys want to send anything else, we're happy to answer questions, but we've got a couple. Lutemplar, who I had on just last night on the call-in show, Shakers basically went extinct because they take a vow of celibacy, and well, if you don't breed, you die. Nice furniture, but Shakers do not equal Quakers. Yes, I think we covered that. He was probably just a little bit ahead of us there. And then a little bit later, he said, it's true what they said. Progressives were born as a Puritan cult. Yeah, it's interesting, right? This is kind of one of Yarvin's, premier observations, where he says that, and this is again when he says about, kind of, I can't remember the exact name of the essay. I think it's part of Open Letter, where he essentially talks about Quaker America. And how this kind of like progressivism is essentially like an extended version of Quaker theology. So obviously you can head to, his, which I think Skeptical Waves has an audio version of. You can find it anywhere, but he goes into a lot of depth from his perspective on why he views progressivism as essentially like a Protestant heresy. But I think that's pretty much, foundational reading for our spheres. And then Machiavelli Sucks to Go just donated and said, good show. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And then this is, I think, Cringewalker of Lutemplar again, talking about, when we were talking about the Mormons, Little known, but there is some mention of ruins with supposed Hebrew inscription from the 1700s. Smith wasn't the first one to claim finding strange artifacts in that area.
Yes, indeed. I understand Mormons are particularly interested in pre-Columbian America for obvious reasons, and Mormon students and scholars are known for going to Central America and going into the Aztec ruins and things like that, looking for any sort of symbolism that they can relate to Jewish civilization. To my knowledge, the claims that Mormons have made about such connections are debatable at best.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually a whole genre of essentially like Mormon speculative fiction, kind of like as a Mormon version of the Left Behind series, if you will, but all about these kind of like pre-Columbian civilizations. And it's interesting that much like kind of, evangelical Protestants have kind of like crowdfunded their own movies. There's like a subgenre of essentially like Mormon fiction movies, and then none of them are particularly good, but they are out there. And it's interesting because I obviously just didn't, there aren't very many Mormons in the American South. I think it was famously, was it Arkansas or Oklahoma, where it was technically still legal to kill Mormons until the 70s.
Turnip Seed knows all about that. I love our Turnip Seed. He's the one.
I know. I've been truly impressed with how much of a ruckus he's been able to cause in the.
I'm so proud of him. He deserves champagne toasts. Bravo for Turnip Seed.
Well, anyway, I don't see any more questions coming in, George. Is there anything else you want to bring up to kind of bring this to a close?
Yeah. I thought of something with your last remark. Was thinking about Mormon art and Mormon artists. It's a really interesting subject. They do have some interesting writers associated with them. Orson Scott Card is one, the science fiction author. He is a Mormon, and I think he lives in North Carolina, of all places. I think Skeptical Waves actually published something by Orson Scott Card about modern religious sensibilities. I'm trying to remember just what it was. But
I think so. He also did one on. He also did a good Orson Scott Card piece on fiction writing. I can't remember exactly what it was, but yeah, I do remember that. Skeptical Waves has a series. I think they must have published some collection of his essays. And so you can listen to him talk about religion in one, and then, I think it was about like inappropriate content in fiction and how people kind of use like sex and violence as a crutch. But that's neither here nor there. So he has at least several essays by Orson Scott Card on his channel. But anyway, you were saying.
I'm interested in Orson Scott Card. I don't claim that I know much about him, but I know he teaches creative writing, for instance. And I think he has interesting things to say. I'm sympathetic I've mentioned before, I'm a little sympathetic with the Mormons. I suppose our situation living in the ashes has created strange bedfellows. I like seeing people who are able to believe things in this environment. And being a member, I'm sorry.
I said, and believe them confidently.
Yes, actually live their lives going against the flow and having a heritage that is despised and mocked, and yet holding their heads up high. I admire that. That is manly. That is good. And it takes that sort of behavior to survive what we undergo today. We need to cultivate those virtues in ourselves. And I'm a member of a very small and obscure group in America. There aren't very many Eastern Orthodox Christians in America, but I have something to learn from these groups who are also, dismissed or discarded. But
Right. And there's also something to be learned from the fact of like the Mormons especially know how to act as a minority, and they've done very well for themselves, in their own area and also just in
yes,
government. And I, without being too explicit about that, I think that's a skill we ought to learn.
yes, they built their own parallel institutions, for instance, and that is a really interesting example. Now, I have friends who are ex-Mormons, and I like talking to them about it. They converted to Orthodoxy, strangely enough, by way of neo-paganism, and they tell me that Mormon institutions are going just as woke as other institutions in our society, which I lament. I would much rather them, I don't know, do their own traditional thing, whatever that is. I don't claim to know what it is, but
Well, right. If
why
we're
should
going
they
to have
be like
Mormons,
everybody else? Why should Brigham Young University be like any state university? It shouldn't. And it's tragic that it's not. They should do Brigham Young stuff, whatever that is.
well, exactly. And it's interesting because if you pay attention to these, you see the kind of like guns of progressive media turned on the Mormons. There's all of these like exposés, quote unquote, like, oh, do you know that at Brigham Young University, a lot of people get married when they're young, right out of college? They're expected to start families. Isn't it awful? All of these people getting married. And again, you're like, well, look, I don't agree with Mormon theology at all. We've said that, but I'm beginning to think that the reason they're so despised has absolutely nothing to do with theology and has a whole lot to do with the fact that they're not progressive clients.
That's right. At least the ones that believe the teachings of their sect, they are in that camp.
So we had another question come in from John Carter, who I will say has been saying very, very funny things in the live chat. And I know it's been a serious stream, so I've not been highlighting them, but I did notice them and I laughed at them. But he says, someday I'd love to hear Bagby talk about the Anabaptists in America, as well as the Amana colonies, if he has any experience.
I know very little about the Amana group. I know they're in Iowa. I know that they were a secular group, at least if I'm remembering it correctly. I do have a book on my shelf about them. Let me take a look here because I know right where it is. Nordhoff, Community, or the Communistic Societies of the United States, Charles Nordhoff. And I've got it on my shelf here, but I have not read his chapter on Amana. But he would be the contemporary authority on the community. I am very interested in Baptist groups. I was actually talking this afternoon about Baptist groups. And I would like to do more reading on the subject. There seem to be two interesting camps in the Baptists. There's landmarkers. Landmarkers believe that all of Christian history, as known by everyone else in Christianity, is more or less a conspiracy to libel Baptist groups. So landmark Baptists say that the Gnostics, the Albigensians, the Cathars, the Nestorians, the Arians were all Baptists. And they were being libeled and accused of complete falsehoods by the official church. And that Baptists are actually the apostolic church in hiding through all of the history. Now, they don't actually have any documents for this at all. It is basically a conspiratorial view that the Baptists are the apostolic church. And you have to give them courage for making that argument, at least. I mean, they believe apostolic roots are absolutely necessary for legitimacy. And so do I. So I give them that.
Well, you have to, and this is with any religion. There's a certain point where you do have to just like admire the gall of it. You know,
Yes.
like this isn't a
Yes.
small claim. This isn't like, oh, we have a minor disagreement about the Council of Trent or something. It's like that. It's like, no, no, no. Everything is 180 degrees flipped, just completely wrong.
Right.
Uh,
Well, I understand. I understand the more mainstream Baptists, like most Baptists are not landmarkers, but more mainstream Baptists would relate themselves back to Zwingli and the Anabaptist reformers in some way. So that would be like the opinion that the Baptists are actually part of the Reformation. That is their genesis. That is where they came from. The landmarkers deny that stringently. And I encounter landmarkers very frequently, and I care very much about these people. So I want to take their position seriously. But outside of a few very short tracts with no footnotes, I can't get much information about their beliefs and where they came from. So I really want to get more information about them, and I need a big library to do that, I guess.
well, that's a very, very well thought out answer. It's interesting. I have and I won't say his name until I confirm him on the show, but a mutual friend of ours, Bagby, who's an expert on both like Southern American history and also Southern Christian American history. And I've been trying to get him on to talk about the history of Presbyterianism across the U.S., which is also quite interesting. Because a lot of this, it is, on one hand, people always say like, oh, like, Protestants in particular are always fracturing, which is partially true. But there are kind of four main traditions. And these branches, much like they're not completely correlated with the with the 4 or 5 groups from Albion seed, but they're quite close. And so the history of these groups can kind of provide a second level of information when you look at American history, and similarly to how Thomas talks about kind of like the ethnic component of American politics, which is often let out. Similarly, you lose a dimension, if you're not seeing kind of like the religious and cultural aspect of these kind of like I guess like American conflicts.
Absolutely. And there is strong correspondence from these Anglo groups that settled colonies on the seaboard of the United States, and their religious traditions and how those traditions evolve and where they go, and the political priorities that go with those traditions. Religion and politics have a lot of correspondence with one another. What people believe about God and the nature of man and the story of evil and redemption has an awful lot to do with what they will believe about politics and what should go on as far as justice. And if we remember the map that we looked at with the Second Great Awakening, where the reformist activity took place and where it spread, you would notice the area that was highlighted on this map goes from Massachusetts across Western New York, across practically all of Ohio, and into Indiana in part. And this area was almost entirely settled by people from New England. And though we've talked about the influence of Quakers and kind of their outsized role in American religion and thought and posture, we see the Second Great Awakening has an awful lot to do with that Puritan heritage. I like to point out where these people were from in my overview. We have lots of New Englanders and then people from Western New York. And Western New York kind of served as the frontier for those isolated, landlocked New England states that cannot expand westward. Those people went into Western New York before they went off to places like Ohio. Part of Ohio is actually given to Connecticut so that their their children would have a place to go and settle. And they didn't have to divide the farms back in tiny little Connecticut further and further, impoverishing future generations. They sent some of their people out west to northern Ohio. So that area had a Puritan culture. And it was the descendants of those people that joined the Mormon church and went west, became Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists. These traditions correspond with one another. There's a reason why Southerners did not go off and become Christian Scientists, why Virginia Cavaliers were not interested in this utopian city on a hill project down in Virginia, did not join these things, did not build communes. It wasn't part of their heritage. They didn't think of religion that way. They had a more traditional Christian mindset, and they knew that the kingdom of heaven is not of this world. They did not sign up for utopian projects. They didn't go in for chiliasm. And this is the legacy of what we call Bible Belt Christianity in America. It's an older kind of Christian belief. It's a different kind of Christian belief. Whereas these areas we're describing are now the most irreligious areas of the United States. Massachusetts has the lowest level of church attendance in the United States today. And yet it was this hotbed of political and religious innovation in our history. It's burned out. The area is still a burned over district. Sadly, I think religion has a role in our lives, should have a role in our lives. We ought to treat these things seriously. It's not just a bunch of made up stuff.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I hope you guys at home can see how I ended up how I did, right? You know, that a couple hours of George Bagby a day, and you'll end up pretty staunch reactionary. So again, I thank you so much for coming on. This is, you know, obviously a lecture that was very impactful on me and very interesting. And I hope we can have you on again. I know that you're working on potentially, having a course through the academic agency, which, I think that will be really, really interesting, if it's based off of kind of your, the work that you've shown here. Is there anything you want to, shill or direct people towards in the meantime before that comes out?
Yes, I have a little presence on YouTube, and I want to do more there. It's just me reading literature. That's all that it is. It might be something else someday, but it's George Bagby on YouTube. And also I have a Telegram channel. I call it Bagby's Corner. It's just small, modest right now, but eventually I want to share like good quotes that I've collected. Right now I'm sharing photographs that I've taken on travels and observations. It's nothing very serious or organized, but if you want to follow my work, those are places that you can find me for now. And I'll be back on the Jay Burden Show. I don't know how often, but I'll come back
as often as we can manage it, I guess. But anyway, guys,
right.
As far as my stuff, you know where to find me. The show is available on YouTube. It is also available as an audio-only show on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio podcasts. In addition, I have very recently started an Odyssey channel. Odyssey is an alternative to YouTube that, I'll be honest, I actually prefer to YouTube. It's a better system. It's a better app. It is, much less advertising. And it's completely, you can say whatever you want there, right? And so all my stuff is backed up there. I'm kind of getting a feeling that our days are numbered here. And so I'm trying to push people over to the audio show and over to Odyssey, where we have a little bit more lateral freedom, so to speak. And if you guys want to support the show, I don't require it, but I do appreciate it. There are different ways you can do that down in the description. I basically will take anything. And again, guys, thank you so much for coming out. And remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.
complicated, you know?